Good morning, everyone. This is Kirsten Logan, the training coordinator from COVA. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a listen-only presentation today for those who aren't familiar with GoToWebinar. To ask a question of our presenter, Kara, go ahead and navigate to your toolbar, which is the gray bar with an arrow and an orange box, and type in your question. And Kara and I are going to kind of jointly attend to the questions. You should receive an email later today that states your attendance at this webinar. If you are using this webinar towards COVA's Voluntary Victim Advocate Certification, you will need to send that email in with your packet, and please keep it for your training records. If you're watching this presentation online later, we hope you find it useful, but please note that archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's Victim Advocate Certification. This is number 2 in our 3 webinar series on human trafficking, and we're so thrilled and lucky to have Kara Napolitano present these to us. Next up, the 3rd and final, will be August 12th at 11 a.m. regarding victim-led investigation and a bit on the ACEs survey. So with that, Kara, take it away.
Okay, hi everyone, good morning. I'm only going to turn my webcam on for a moment before I kind of dive into the presentation, but I just wanted to say hello from a human. I really appreciate you joining us this morning, very early, to talk about human trafficking at 9 a.m. It's very brave, and I really appreciate that. I would be really grateful if folks would put into the chat their names and what they do. Just maybe who you work for, or what your role is there, something like that. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to see those as they come in, really just so I know who's in the audience, so I can tailor the presentation best to who is in the audience. Great, so I'm seeing, hi Brandon, I'm seeing Megan, Victim Services, so I've got 2 victim service providers. If anyone else wants to put something in there, that would be helpful. Okay, it's early, it's okay. Well, so yeah, as Kirsten mentioned, this is the second of 3 webinars that we're doing on human trafficking, the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking in COVA. The first one 2 weeks ago was a Human Trafficking 101. So we are going to do just a couple of minutes of review of that, but very little, just to kind of get us all on the same page sort of early in the morning when we're talking about this heavy topic. And then we're going to dive into red flags and behavioral cues and the complexities around identifying those, and as well as disclosure from victims and survivors. And then I'll talk a little bit about protocol development and what we hope for, give you some tools for protocol development. Yeah, so I'm going to turn off my webcam now and get started. So this is just the review part, as mentioned. We talked 2 weeks ago about the federal human trafficking law here in the US and how our state Colorado law mostly adheres to that federal law now in 2020. We finally have kind of caught up with that federal law. And so in the US and in Colorado, we have 3 categories of trafficking. We've got those under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex, those who are 18 and over involved in commercial sex as a separate category, because those individuals are legally required, if in a case, to prove force or fraud or coercion or some combination thereof in order to prove that they were trafficked. And then the 3rd category being forced labor. We did not parse that out into under 18 and over 18 in the US. We just said anyone who is forced to perform labor or services would have to show force or fraud or coercion in order to prove that it was trafficking. There's a lot, we talked through this at greater length 2 weeks ago, but there's a lot of complexities involved just in this definition, as those under the age of 18, many that are under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex may not identify as victims of trafficking if they're not being forced or frauded or coerced into the situation. there's definitely some gray area there, and there's also this kind of fact that we could identify coercion, or we could define coercion differently than they do legally, right? We could say someone is being forced to trade sex, say, for a place to stay because they're experiencing homelessness, and not that they're, an empowered sex worker, right? Those are two different things. And so there's some complexity here around, telling someone who's under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex that they're a victim of something, even though they are acting alone and they don't self-identify as a victim, and they're just doing what they need to do to survive, which may or may not be, trading commercial sex acts for something of value. And it's all equally complicated for those who are 18 and over, needing to prove that element of force, fraud, or coercion, in that it's very difficult to do. And often there's a lack of trust of institutions for individuals that are involved in commercial sex, with or without force or fraud or coercion. There may be a feeling that they may be punished for something. There may be a feeling that they won't be believed. And of course, there may be a fear of their trafficker in disclosing some of that. And then around forced labor, young or older, under 18 or over 18, it's also difficult to prove. And then we have that extra layer of biases. So if someone is being forced to deal drugs under the age of 18, let's say, and they can't easily prove that because they are being coerced by gang members who are, in El Salvador where their family lives or something like that. They may be not only be difficult to prove that they're being forced, but also terrifying and dangerous for them to disclose that they're being forced. And so there's this kind of stew of reasons why people might not be identified as trafficking survivors or trafficking victims, and why they may not self-identify. And even if they do self-identify and are identified by individual victim service providers and law enforcement who are there to help, in the end, when something is actually brought to court, it is difficult to prove those elements of force or fraud or coercion. So just kind of layering on those complexities here up front to talk through these red flags and behavioral cues. How this shows up for us, all of this stew of complexity that I was mentioning, is that survivors are sometimes ashamed or embarrassed of, the quote unquote choices that they've made, though they were made under duress, under coercive threats, etc. The survivor may feel like it was their choice, it is their fault, they made bad choices. Perhaps there's some victim blaming happening. Perhaps it's self-inflicted. People have a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker, in that their trafficker has, if you think back to that push and pull factors slide from 2 weeks ago, that trafficker has actually fulfilled a lot of their needs. They are no longer homeless. They do have a job, quote unquote. And so whatever those needs that trafficker was able to fill, they may be grateful, or perhaps the trafficker is a family member or a lover or a best friend, a peer. And so there's a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker. There's obviously fear. That one's kind of easy to think about. And then there's that mistrust of institutions or law enforcement that we see over and over again from survivors. And how that shows up for us as service providers, well, those of you who answered me in the chat are service providers. We see, sometimes a refusal of services or no emotional reactions whatsoever. So we're hearing, really what we consider traumatic events, and the person who's telling us about them is showing no emotional reactions, or they're uninterested in cooperating with an investigation, or maybe they're just irritable or uncooperative, or they're swearing at us, or they're throwing things. I think anyone who is a service provider would likely have experienced many of these things, and that's a challenge, right? It's a challenge when somebody doesn't want our help. It's a challenge when someone's irritable or uncooperative or showing no emotional reaction whatsoever. It's a challenge for us as service providers. And it may mean that if we are going to identify trafficking, that we're going to have to do it on our own without the help of the survivor. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way, right? Sometimes people are looking for help, or they're kind of ready to ask for help, or at least to see what's out there in terms of what resources are available. But sometimes they're not. And so the best thing that we can do is be aware of that. Be aware that it is the trauma that is likely pushing these individuals into their irritability, or their lack of emotional reaction, or whatever. Recognize that and try to make an identification without disclosure, an upfront disclosure. So why is it hard? I mean, why is this so hard? I think I've just started laying that out. There are a lot of reasons why people don't ask for help besides the trauma. There's language barriers, people who are unaware of or feel that they're unable to access their rights. That could be young people, that could be people who've been on the street for a long time, that could be somebody who's an immigrant or new to this country and isn't aware of what their rights are. Lots of reasons why people might feel that they're unable to access their rights. Perhaps they have a felony and they're not able to access all of their rights because of that. They may have experienced physical or social isolation. We already talked about the stigma or shame. So people are feeling the stigma of shame of things that they've been forced to do. There's fear of retribution, and then that distrust of systems in general. So what is this going to end up looking like? I mean, how are we going to overcome this? There's lots of schools of thought here, and I guess what I'll say first is that everything that we do should be trauma informed. And I know that's sort of a buzzword. In 2 weeks, we're going to focus on that trauma and how it's going to affect interviews, how trauma bonding, and how it affects the brain and all of that. So we're not going to go too much into that now, but everything that we do in all of our interviews and all of our conversations with survivors should be trauma informed. And there's tons of resources on that and what that should look like: trauma informed interviewing, creating trauma informed spaces, depending on, the kinds of clientele that you work with and the spaces where you meet them. But perhaps we'll have a checklist of physical or behavioral cues that will be part of our protocol. And we're going to get to protocol development in just a little bit. And these might be some of them. What we need to keep in mind about red flags and behavioral cues in general is that unfortunately, there's no kind of magic sauce. There's no 1 + 1 = trafficking. Not everybody with a neck tattoo is being trafficked. Not everybody with unexplained injuries or signs of malnourishment is being trafficked. Of course not. And so these should be thought of as a constellation. Once we start seeing multiple, 3, 4, 5 of these red flags, that's when our protocol should kick in. Additionally, it's really super important to get all of the members of your team and staff trained on trafficking, even if they're not folks who might be working with survivors. So I'm talking about front desk staff, security, even parking attendants. I mean, it really depends on the type of facility that you work at. But janitors, cleaners. The idea of having everyone be trained is that different types of people and different people will see different things, or will have access to different either spaces or individuals. So for example, if I'm talking about a hospital setting, a security officer may be able to view an interaction between a trafficker and a trafficking survivor in a parking lot that those at the front desk, and certainly the doctors and nurses that might be seeing that patient, would not be able to see. And so a security officer might just see a conversation and it may raise a red flag. Just one. This conversation looked a little weird. I witnessed the person give the patient their ID back. They didn't have it in their own pocket, and I know that's a potential red flag. And I just want to pass this information on to the person who's going to do the intake. And so we've already got one red flag viewed by somebody who won't see the rest of the interaction with the hospital, but has been trained to know that that interaction should raise a red flag. And then maybe the trafficker accompanies the survivor into the waiting room. And so those individuals who are working at the front desk might see another red flag. Perhaps they overhear a conversation, or they hear the trafficker coaching the survivor on what they should say if they're asked certain questions. And so that person who works at the front desk can now give to the nurse or whomever, the provider, two red flags, what the security person saw in the parking lot and what the front desk person saw while just sitting there waiting. And now the nurse or doctor are kind of going into the examination room with two red flags already kind of peaked up. And so now maybe their guard is up and they're looking for more red flags. That's how this works. So it's super, super important that everyone gets trained. There was an example, actually this was another hospital setting, of an individual who's a cleaner at a hospital, a janitor, and she was from Nigeria and spoke a tribal language there. And the person in the hospital bed was also from that area in Nigeria, and so they spoke the same language. And it was that person, the janitor, who the survivor disclosed to. Now, she didn't say, I'm a human trafficking survivor. She said, I need some help. Here's what's going on. And the janitor had actually had training and was able to understand what was happening and report that to, a nurse who was able to get some more information and get that person some help. So the idea that, kind of everyone counts, and that these small clues are going to be listened to and viewed by different eyes and different ears, that's all a good thing. We want as many people involved in this response as possible. Okay, so now if I'm getting back to the actual red flags and behavioral cues here, what we've got here are things like unexplained injuries, evidence of prolonged infection or time since injury, signs of malnourishment. Of course, not any one of these things alone is going to be an indicator necessarily of trafficking. There are lots of people that have unexplained injuries or signs of malnourishment. People who are experiencing homelessness may, have signs of malnourishment, etc. But coupled with the awkward conversation in the parking lot and the giving back of the ID and the coaching in the waiting room, maybe these three red flags are, a really good indicator of possible trafficking, right? So that's what we want to be thinking about these as a constellation. So when I say unexplained injuries or evidence of prolonged infection or time since injury, what I'm saying is, for example, I know a trafficking survivor who was being trafficked for labor in a construction site. They didn't have the proper safety equipment or training, and actually they ended up falling off the roof and breaking their arm really badly. The break was like a 90-degree angle, like it was broken all the way through. And they were never allowed to get that set. They were never allowed to go to the hospital. And so it healed that way. And so if you see that person now, they still have basically a 90-degree angle in their forearm. That's evidence of time since injury, prolonged time since injury, right? That should be a red flag. Why did you never get this set? What happened here? And you're not just going to see that in a hospital setting. You're going to see that anywhere, right? What happened here? Why didn't you ever get this taken care of? And that could also be an STI or an infection from like a cut or something like that. So people aren't allowed to go get their healthcare needs met often until it's really bad, right, in a trafficking situation, until they're pretty desperate. And so we see that evidence of prolonged time. People are using traffickers are using the withholding of basic human needs to control their victims. And so malnourishment or dehydration or exhaustion are pretty common. I've met multiple survivors who said that they were kept up for days at a time because if you're hungry and you are thirsty and you are exhausted, then you're just less likely to run. You're more likely to comply. So signs of malnourishment are generally poor health. We also see poor dental health. I know that's something people don't often think of, but if you're not allowed to, for example, go to the hospital when your arm is broken, you're also likely not, getting regular dental checkups. And so we see a lot of dental issues. Of course, frequent or repeated STIs, if we're talking about a sex trafficking situation. Same thing with multiple or frequent pregnancies or abortions. Exposure is a big one. A lot of trafficking situations happen outside. So somebody is working outside, somebody is exposed to the elements, perhaps they're not wearing proper safety equipment or even just proper covering from the sun or from the wind. And so we see, extreme exposure to wind or sun or cold. Repeated motion injuries and cardiovascular respiratory problems. We can see this in both sex and labor trafficking. We've had cases of very young people having heart attacks because it's really stressful, right? This is a very incredibly stressful situation. There was a report from Doha. Is it Doha? Yeah, I think I'm saying that right. I think it's Doha, where they're having the next World Cup. Well, supposedly, I guess pandemic allowing, and they've been having workers having heart attacks in their early 20s because they're working out in 120-degree weather, building the sites for where the World Cup will be played. Respiratory problems might be individuals working with chemicals without proper safety equipment. We've also had cases of people dropping pesticides on people while they're working in agricultural settings here in Colorado. Chronic back pain, repeated motion injuries. People are doing the same activity for very long periods of time. So we also see that with street-based sex work, where people are just on their feet for really long periods of time, sometimes wearing high heels, and so a lot of foot pain and back pain associated with that as well. Although street-based prostitution is less so during the pandemic and in general as web-based sex work is increasing. We definitely see some tattoos and other types of branding, often with sex trafficking situations. Sometimes we'll see someone branded or tattooed with the name of the pimp and the date of initiation. We also see different signs. We see suits like diamonds, spades, clubs, hearts, or a king's crown, king or queen crowns are common tattoos. But again, right, everyone with a tattoo isn't necessarily being trafficked. Of course, evidence of sexual trauma, that one's pretty obvious. Substance misuse, that one is something I think I talked about last week too, but we see, substance misuse and addiction being used by the trafficker as another means of control. So someone may be targeted specifically because they're using substances, because somebody who is using substances is easier to control. You can offer them the substance that they want and they will do what you say. You confront it to them and they will do what they say. What you say, they're willing to do whatever it takes to get high. If they're in a situation where they've run out of their substance, we also see people being forced to use substances against their will in order to be more compliant. And then, of course, we see people using substances really just to ease some of the pain of this experience. So we see substance misuse used very frequently in trafficking situations. And it's another thing that we tend to, as a society, sort of look down on, right? We kind of forget that there are all these things tied up with substances other than just bad choices, right? So just something to keep in mind. If we're looking at behavioral indicators, again, just being careful here. None of these are meant to, cause hysteria or fear. They're not meant to be fear-based, but they can feel that way occasionally. If someone is claiming to be just visiting the area or doesn't know their location, if they don't know what state they're in, that should be a red flag. Or they say something like, I think I'm in Colorado because of the mountains. I've definitely heard people say, I was brought to some mountain area, I have no idea where it was, that kind of thing. So if somebody doesn't know where they're at, that should be a red flag. numerous inconsistencies. This could be an indicator of a lot of things. It could be somebody who is coached to give you specific answers to questions by their trafficker. It could be somebody who wasn't coached but is trying to protect their trafficker for various reasons of trauma bonding and potentially loving their trafficker. So they're trying to protect them or themselves from potentially being arrested for some crime that they were forced to commit as a result of their trafficking. So the inconsistency could be lying as a result of coaching or choice. Or it could be trauma, right? It could be that somebody experienced trauma and they're just not able to remember things in a linear way. And so their story's kind of jumping around in timing and place. And to somebody who hasn't experienced trauma, that could sound like lying, even though it might not be. So lots of reasons why there may be inconsistencies in someone's story. This next one, someone claiming to speak for or on behalf of the individual, that should be a big red flag in a lot of settings. This could be someone who's saying that they will translate, or it might be someone, saying, I'm not going to leave this person. They don't want me to leave this person. I refuse to leave, or something like that. Of course, they may have coached the victim to agree to that, yes, I want them here, or not, or they may just want to be in the room. So it's these are difficult to identify. One thing I will say, 100%, a friend or a family member should never be used as an interpreter. There should always be a trained interpreter, and if you don't have one, you should be able to call a language line to get a trained interpreter to speak for the victim, so that you can interview them or have a conversation with them alone without someone offering that translation. There's lots of reasons for that, right? We probably all know survivors who have had their trafficker speak for them. I've heard numerous labor trafficking cases where the landowner in an agricultural setting will bring in one of their workers and say, I speak Spanish, I'll translate for you. And then if you as the provider don't speak Spanish, then you don't actually know what they're saying to the person, and you don't know what the person is saying to them. And so they could really be telling you whatever they want. This is a tricky one because we want to be culturally sensitive. So if somebody isn't comfortable, being alone with you, we do want to be culturally sensitive to that. But we want to have other options rather than perhaps the person staying in the room. Maybe we can have a different gender provider come in. We can make sure the door is shut. We can make sure the door is open. Whatever is going to make that person feel more comfortable. Or we can use different tactics to get somebody separated from somebody else for just a few minutes. I need a urine sample, or, come with me, we need to do this check-in in this other room, or, please, the person who is accompanying them, we might ask them to go fill out some paperwork at the front desk, or we might ask them to, I don't know, even go get some ice or a blanket or something, or some water, and we might send them on sort of a wild goose chase so that they're gone for a little while. Whatever it is, we should have some separation procedures as part of our protocol in order to get people alone. And, also keeping in mind that getting someone alone doesn't necessarily mean they're going to disclose, even though you might have grave suspicions and red flags are flying around. Someone still might not disclose when they're alone, and that's okay. It may not be the right time for them. So just wanted to add that in as a note. Someone who doesn't have any legal documentation, or someone who is not in control of their own documentation. This is very common in both labor and sex trafficking, that a pimp or a labor trafficker will be holding on to somebody's ID. So if you see that exchange, that should be a red flag, or somebody has to ask somebody else for their ID, that should be a red flag. This first one on this last list of red flags and behavioral indicators is another one that I just want to caution. Sure, youth having relationships with older unexplained adults could be a potential trafficking situation, or could just be a youth having a relationship with an older unexplained adult. I don't want to cause any panic with those kinds of indicators. So it's just one on a list, right? Someone who's paying with cash when they, might normally pay with a credit card, especially if they don't look like they should have that much cash in their pocket, or if you saw someone hand them a wad of cash. Someone who is downplaying their health problems or risks, or exhibiting paranoia or fear or submission, any kind of tension or hostility. I mean, these are all trauma behaviors. They're all very different, and so that's not an easy one to identify. Everyone's trauma response is going to be different, but if they're having trauma responses or they're being triggered by things, then you at least might know that they have experienced trauma. They may resist your help. We've already talked a little bit about that. These are real quotes from service providers and law enforcement, and they're not nice, right? They're not nice to see, but this is what people are up against, right? This is what they've heard from service providers and law enforcement in the past. Not everyone, I'm generalizing, of course. And I also, recognize that there's amazing people on this call, and I'm not suggesting that any of you have ever used sentences like this, right? But if people have heard this before, when they were experiencing exploitation or abuse, they're less likely to think that anyone is going to help, anyone in our position of power. And even if many of us as service providers or individuals who work with survivors maybe don't feel like we're in a position of power, of course we are. We are not in a trauma space. We are, quote unquote, there to help. We may have a file on these individuals with a lot of private information. We're asking them to tell us a story, and in many cases, tell us about the trauma that's happened to them. Why are they here? And so we are in a position of power. And because of all of the things that they've experienced in the past, they're just unlikely to trust us, at least right up front. That doesn't mean we can't gain their trust. So I want to talk a little bit about protocol development now that I've talked about these red flags and behavioral cues and kind of made some references to what a protocol should have. Because we have such different types of attendees today, it's hard for me to give you like the number one, the perfect, protocol toolkit. I think based on your physical, geographical location, based on the type of clientele that you see, based on the types of trafficking or exploitation you've seen in the past, based on language barriers or lack of language barriers that you're used to seeing, and based on the kinds of resources that you can offer in-house. All of those things are going to help you shape what your protocol should look like. But I think the most important thing is that we have one, right? I hear over and over again from providers, now that I've had this training, I'm pretty sure that I've seen trafficking survivors in the past, right? And we missed it. And there were times, and this is what I've heard from providers, that there were times where they suspected, either trafficking or something amiss. And they didn't say anything or pass on any information to those survivors because they didn't know if they were right. They didn't know if passing on the information would be appropriate. They didn't know if the referral they were making was trauma informed. They didn't know of all of the available resources, or they didn't know there was a human trafficking hotline. So if you have protocols in place before the next trafficking survivor presents in whatever setting you work in, then your employees, your staff are empowered to take that next step, even if the next step is just passing on a phone number or letting someone know that you believe them and that they are welcome to come back anytime, right? even if that is your only next step because this person isn't in a place where they're ready to disclose, just having that protocol empowers your staff. The protocol itself is going to provide information, right? It's going to have a list of red flags and behavioral cues. It's going to have a list of phone numbers and potential resources. So what I've listed here are a handful of protocol tools that I really like. NITEC, the National Human Trafficking Training or Technical Training Awareness Center, created an adult human trafficking screening tool and guide. So a screening tool is different than a protocol, to be clear, but the guide itself is like a 61-page document that gives a lot of recommendations on how to start these conversations, how to be trauma informed and make sure that people are feeling comfortable and safe where they might disclose if they are ready to. These pages 9 and 10 and 16 through 17 just have some excellent guidelines for that. 16 through 17 actually has their screening tool and potential questions that you could add to your intake procedures if they seem appropriate for your clientele. None of these should be cut and pasted into the work that you do because everyone's work is so different. But really, there's some great nuggets of information in this adult human trafficking screening tool and guide. The HEAL Trafficking Protocol Toolkit. HEAL is a national anti-trafficking organization that's run by medical doctors, really focusing on that public health approach to ending human trafficking and the intersection between healthcare and trafficking. So this particular protocol toolkit is focused on healthcare providers, but it is incredibly useful for really any service provider or even law enforcement protocol development. Again, just making it relevant to the work that you do. Avera has a pretty good human trafficking protocol. Hope for Justice has developing a protocol for reporting victims of trafficking document itself. So helping folks to develop that protocol. And the other one that I put in here was the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. They have a protocol recommendation for educators. So if you work with young people, this one might be helpful as well. And then these are just some of the components that all protocol should have, right? So it should have that basic list of human trafficking indicators, red flags based on local trends. What do you see here, right? What are you likely to see based on your clientele, based on your location, the types of trafficking that are common? You should have some type of separation procedures, recommendations, right? Nothing is going to be set in stone in any of these cases, but if you have just some ideas for folks in your protocol that may help them to separate people who don't want to be separated. Just keeping in mind that we want to be culturally sensitive as well. You should have interview procedures, trauma-informed interview procedures. Perhaps it's a screening tool. Perhaps it's just techniques for motivational interviewing. It really, again, depends on the type of intakes that you do and the type of questions that you would normally ask. But interview procedures, to some extent, should be part of your protocol development. You might want to have safety planning. Again, depending on your clientele. If you work with young people, you might create a safety plan for their runs if they run multiple times, or if you expect recidivism among the population that you work with, if you expect people to go back to the street or go back to the life, safety planning may be part of your protocol. You definitely want to be aware of all mandatory reporting requirements. Those are going to be different state by state, and they're going to be different according to the age of the individuals that you work with, and they're going to be different based on the kinds of resources that you offer. So I definitely can't generalize about mandatory reporting requirements, except that I could remind you of something that we discussed last week, which is the passage of Now I'm forgetting what the Senate bill was called, but in 2016 we passed a bill in Colorado that made, if you're a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you are a mandatory reporter of child sex trafficking. It basically effectively made child sex trafficking an official form of child abuse. And then in 2019 we amended that law to include child labor trafficking. So if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you are also a mandatory reporter of child sex and labor trafficking. But that's just one component of mandatory reporting, of course, and specific to Colorado. You want to have referral process. You want to know who are the folks in Colorado or in the greater Denver area who support survivors of trafficking. You want to know which of them works with only youth or which of them works with adults. You want to know if some of them have a focus on labor trafficking. You want to know what languages are spoken at each place. You want to have an understanding that all the referrals that you're making, the individuals that work there are trauma informed. So when you make a referral, you're not sending someone into a situation where they may be re-traumatized. So that takes a little bit of work. I don't think it's that much work. I mean, I think it's possible. I think you can create a referral process pretty easily. And potentially you want to have follow-up procedures. In an ideal world, the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline is part of that protocol. And maybe it's all of the protocol. I mean, it depends on what you do, right, in-house. Perhaps you don't offer any in-house resources. And if you call the Human Trafficking Hotline, you can be connected to around 330 organizations statewide that offer resources that are trauma informed, that have been educated on human trafficking. So of course, I'm biased. I work for the organization that manages the Human Trafficking Hotline, but it's not as if we profit off of it or anything like that. So we hope and we are striving for the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline to be part of everyone's protocol. So I know that I showed you this 2 weeks ago, but I would love it if you didn't then to put these numbers into your phone and just know that we're there 24/7. You can talk to a professional, someone who's gone through 50 plus hours of human trafficking training and who is trained to know all of those resources pretty much inside and out. And so, you don't have to start from scratch here. This is information that we're willing to share. So call us. You can always get in touch with me. I can send you these protocol documents. Email me anytime for that kind of thing. I'm really happy to help anyone, consult with anyone to get those protocols set. I've done it with hospitals across the state, and I have just, I don't know, 20 or 30 example protocols in my repertoire. So I'm happy to share those with folks if anyone's interested, if you want to follow up with me at a later time. What I also tell communities, we're in the greater Denver community. And so it's a little bit different in that we have a lot of resources, right? In the greater Denver area, we have a concentration of human trafficking partnerships and organizations that receive federal funding to support survivors statewide, like COVA, like Colorado Legal Services, like TESSA down in Colorado Springs, like Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, like Asia Pacific Development Center. So those organizations, are mostly based in the greater Denver area. So we've got a bit of a head start on these kind of community-led solutions. But I also want you to know that when I go into communities across the state, no matter how big or how small, how rural or how frontier they may be, or potentially urban, I have these conversations around developing community-led solutions. So it's not only important for individual organizations to have a protocol, though it is vital. It's also in my dream, in my head, every community, and communities can define what a community is themselves, right? For some folks, it's a county, like where I live. I live in Summit County, Colorado. I live in Frisco, but Summit County is a community because we're such a small county. We have 27,000 people who live county-wide. We kind of function as one community, even though there's 5 towns in Summit County. And that may be different for other communities, right? I know that Durango and Cortez are only about an hour away from each other down in the Four Corners area, but I know that they really function separately from each other as 2 separate communities. So it really depends on what the community is. But I talk through this, that there should be a community protocol. Not every community has the kinds of resources that the greater Denver area has. And so people have to adjust. They have to rely on, for example, a domestic violence shelter potentially to offer a bed or two to a potential trafficking survivor, because there isn't a trafficking shelter in the area, or something like that, right? In rural communities, we have to adjust and we have to use the resources that we have. And then we also might have in our protocol as a rural community, just knowledge of the 5 or 6 organizations that function statewide to support survivors. So again, I'm partially just telling you this because I want you to know, like, the kinds of conversations that we're having across the state, which is, don't wait, right? Don't wait for some statewide protocol to suddenly make it to your desk. If we do create a statewide protocol in Colorado, it will likely not work really well in, random rural towns like, say, Montrose or Delta, where trafficking survivors may have to travel for hours in order to find resources. So develop community-led solutions, have internal protocols for the organization that you work with, and then have external protocols for the community that you're in. And know about what other communities are doing, so that if a survivor wants to leave the community that they were abused in, that we can find a way to get them to another community. And we can talk about a little bit more about how we're connecting communities if I have some more time at the end of this presentation. What I hope that folks will take away today is that this isn't easy work. I think probably everyone already knows that. But again, there's no obvious red flag that always means trafficking. There's no obvious behavioral cue, and survivors are resistant to our help. And so we have to be aware of our own biases and the kinds of language that we're using so that we can build that trust with survivors. Because often if they don't disclose, we simply don't have anything to stand on. We don't have anywhere to go. If someone doesn't want our help, we're not going to be able to help them. And if we are making assumptions and using inappropriate language, even if it's by accident, we're gonna break that trust, and they're never gonna disclose to us. And it may even contribute to their lack of trust of institutions in the first place. So everyone has biases. That's okay. But we must be aware of those and prepared to learn and grow, and to try to mirror people's language, to try to actively listen to folks, and to try our very best to shed some of those biases that can really set up barriers between service providers and survivors. And then we have to be flexible. This is hard. It's hard for humans to be flexible, and some more than others. But we have to redefine success, because our version of what success looks like is going to really depend on what our job is. So if I work for law enforcement, my definition of success is probably arresting a perpetrator and prosecuting them successfully. But the survivor's definition of success might be escaping a exploitative situation and taking a bus home to Ohio. and that might be it for them. They have no desire to go through the very traumatic process of prosecuting their trafficker, and they're grateful that you want to do that, but they're not interested, or whatever, right? We cannot go into a situation deciding what is best for somebody, because all that does is add an extra layer of exploitation onto their experience. You know, what really differentiates us as service providers or law enforcement from the trafficker ourselves is allowing for autonomy, allowing for choice. And so if we allow the survivor to decide what is best for them, to decide what next steps they want to take, to be flexible in what we think our expectations should be, then we're going to build that trust, and we're going to stop the cycle of traumatization, stop the cycle of exploitation, or at least try to, for that survivor. So that's what I hope we can take away today. And I'm just acknowledging the time there. I see I've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm just gonna play this, this short clip. It's like 3.5 minutes. It's from the Reveal podcast from the Center for Investigative Reporting. And it's about a sex trafficking of a minor situation.
And Kara, I'm not hearing anything or seeing a video play.
You're not hearing it. Is that what you said?
Yeah, correct. I'm not hearing it or kind of seeing anything different, just FYI.
Sorry, okay, it is just a radio clip, but I guess I'm not sharing my sound appropriately. I'm just trying to figure out how to do that. Sorry, folks.
Is that little like megaphone thing to the left of the drawing of the woman? Is that
Yeah, that's what I clicked on. I mean, that's what I pressed, that's how I pressed play, but I think, yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think I have time to figure out how to fix that, so I apologize. What I can tell you is it's a story. It's a true story of a young girl who was trafficked for sex. She went on multiple runs. She was being pimped out by multiple people, and she met a cop who treated her as a victim. Who she ran and went back to the life, I think 5 times. And each time she was picked up and sort of returned back to eventually to this officer who specialized in these types of cases. And over time, he built trust with her. And I think the quote that always sticks with me from this clip is when she says, the victim says, what I will always remember is when he says, I am here to protect you. I will protect you. It's just what stuck with her. And she eventually came out of the life, she got sober, and she's kind of reflecting on, why that is. And really what she says is that, this officer in this case was willing to be patient, to believe her, and to build that trust. And eventually she believed him. But it took 5 runs and probably some fairly traumatic experiences that she had during those runs for her to build that trust. And like, that sucks, right? If I'm being honest, like, that's not fun. We don't want to hear that. As service providers, we want it to be easier. We want people to do it, to accept our help right away, and we want to have all the right solutions. And the problem is that we try to make people make changes before they're ready. Because we think we know what's best, right? And so I wanted to share this with you as the final slide. This is the model, the theory of change. It basically is what it's saying is that people won't change until they're ready, and we can't kind of force it. So this theoretical model of change, or trans-theoretical model of change, is true for any type of change. So you could think about it in terms of like quitting smoking cigarettes, perhaps. We start in pre-contemplation with no intention of changing that behavior. We move into contemplation where we're aware a problem exists, but we have no commitment to action. And then we may prepare, we may be intent upon taking action. We may take an action, actively modify our behavior. There's a maintenance phase. And then there's relapse. And it's not that everybody relapses, but that we know that relapse is a normal part of the theoretical model of change, that we expect it and that we're not punishing people because they're doing something that is very human and very natural. So if we meet somebody who's in the pre-contemplation stage and has no intention of changing what we consider to be potentially a harmful behavior, and we say, quit it, right? Run it, leave that pimp, or quit the life, or just leave your trafficker, what's your problem, right? It's really not going to do much to help us, to help that person, or to help our relationship with that person, because all it is going to do is actually break that trust. They don't get it. They don't understand how much I love this person. And so all it's really going to do is set us up for failure. So if we recognize the stage that somebody is in, and we work with them within that stage to try to help to move them to the next stage of change, then perhaps we can have more effect. So I guess what I do have one more slide here that I think I have time for, since I didn't play that last video or the last recording. And that brings us into harm reduction. So this can be a little bit controversial for folks, and that's okay. But if we meet somebody who's somewhere in the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage of change, and they're still doing harmful things, or what we consider to be perpetrating harmful behaviors, like maybe selling sex or using substances or working in an unsafe environment, perhaps in the informal economy, then one thing that we can do to move them to another stage is to practice harm reduction techniques. Now, we could do a whole training on what that means and additional techniques for harm reduction, but since we just have a few minutes here, what I'll say is those kinds of behaviors that I mentioned, like using substances or selling sex or working in the informal economy, can potentially be harmful, right? We know these are risky behaviors, and we know that things can happen. And we know that they may lead to exploitation. Not always, but that they may. And so if we reduce some of the harm of those potentially harmful behaviors, then we're reducing the potentiality for exploitation by reducing that harm. And so even though some of these techniques might feel a little uncomfortable for us, it might even feel like we're condoning that behavior, what we're really doing is just meeting people where they're at. We're meeting them at the pre-contemplation or contemplation phase of their model of change. And we're saying, we're not judging you, right? We're meeting you where you're at. Let's talk about what's going to happen next time you run. Let's talk about what's going to happen next time you go out looking for substances. Or let's talk about ways that we can stay safe in an informal employment situation. Because then we're in a place where we're actually potentially preventing exploitation, and certainly overall lessening the harm and trauma, and hopefully building that trust, so that somebody may eventually disclose. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I'd love to answer some questions if anyone has any. We've got a few minutes here. And maybe help me out with that, Kirsten, if you can, because I'm not seeing anything come in, and I'm not sure if it's me or that there's no questions.
Yeah, no problem. We'll give folks a minute to get typing.
Sure.
Yeah, that was excellent. I really love this model of change, and I'm trying to apply it to myself, to having gone from basically not having a sweet tooth to eating ice cream like 5 nights a week right now. I'm prepared to take action.
Yeah. That's so funny. That's actually sometimes the example that I use is just my addiction to chocolate. and how this can be applied to really any behavior that we want to change. So yeah, that's a great example.
I mean, because, it feels like the world's going to end tomorrow, so why do I need to stop eating ice cream, right?
Totally, absolutely.
All right. Yeah, I'm not seeing, you'd get the little question mark like when some folks answered at the beginning.
Okay.
Not seeing that at the moment, but I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And really, if anyone is interested, please do reach out. I'd love to help with protocol development. I'm happy to have a conversation diving deeper into harm reduction if that is helpful for anyone, and have a list of harm reduction resources